conservative yeshiva this summer, and I found it very interesting, so I wanted to bring it to you. So Hannah-Valeria Grishko is an MSW and an LCSW, MBACP, is a licensed psychotherapist in New York State. She's a member of the British Association for Counseling and Psychotherapy, a certified clinical trauma specialist, a teaching member of the Israeli Sandplay Therapy Association and the International Society for Sandplay Therapy. An international speaker, Hannah-Valeria has presented her work at conferences and training programs in the United States, the UK, Romania, Israel, and Russia. Her work has been published in the Journal of Sandplay Therapy, and she is a contributing author for the book Into the Heart of Sandplay, which was published in 2018. Her psychotherapy practice includes working with children, adults, families, and couples for more than 20 years in public and private settings in New York City, London, and Jerusalem. Some of her areas of interest include loss and bereavement, trauma, issues of identity, and immigration, as well as embodiment in healing. She speaks English, French, and Russian. So with no further ado, I will let Hannah start speaking.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Barbara, for your introduction. Hello. Thank you very much for being here. I would just like to say a couple of things about the administrative piece, and that, first of all, I apologize for having to mute you. I really do apologize. I hate doing it, but I do it in love, because otherwise we're going to have a mess. There's going to be a lot of noise, and it's very hard to hear, and it's frustrating for everyone, so I apologize. So what I've done is I've muted everyone. I will speak for a little while, and then once I stop, I will, of course, you'll have a chance to unmute yourself, but then we can have a time for questions, comments, sharing, and whatever you would like to bring to the discussion. So at this, what you can also do, though, is that you can write your questions or comments, if you cannot wait until the end, to the chat box. Now, when I'm sharing screen with you, I cannot see the chat box. So Barbara and I have agreed that Barbara will keep an eye on the chat box. There is something extremely pressing that she will let me know. If there's, if there's some technical things, maybe she will be able to respond. I don't know. But so you can write in the chat box. Just remember, I won't see it until I stop sharing screen. Okay? So Barbara, I will mute you, but you can unmute yourself if you feel there's a desperate need, in which case,
Okay, thanks. Sounds good.
To speak. I think this might be it for the technical part. Yeah, I think that's nothing more I need to say before we begin. So thank you again, Barbara, for introducing me. So you don't really need to go over the things that I do and why I do what I do. I will only say that my, many ways, my professional memberships and my languages speak to where I've lived and where I've been. I was born in Ukraine, and my parents immigrated to the United States when I was a teenager, and so I've lived a large part of my life in the United States. And then also in France, England, and now I live in Israel for the last 2 years. I've lived in Israel. So my languages speak to my very much life experience and my interest in working with immigration and immigrants. And often, it's been very much a reality that people who live somewhere who are not from that place often find me for therapy. So what we'd like to do today is I'd like to share some of my thoughts about the emotional challenges that have emerged as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, and also what are some of the psychological tools that we can use to help us through this quite challenging time in many ways, to feel more balanced, to feel more grounded, to feel more settled. And I'd like to just begin. I apologize also for my voice. I forgot to say, I'm sorry about my voice. I don't have coronavirus, so it's just I have a bad cold, so I apologize. I know nowadays I feel like you have to explain if you have any kind of upper respiratory infection, you have to explain that you're not dying. So so just wanted to say a few words, not a lot, but just to say something about what I've observed as an emotional picture that I have noticed and my colleagues have noticed as the pandemic began to unravel. And one of the very prevailing feelings and emotional reactions I've noticed was fear. fear of the unknown, because what we were seeing and noticing, or we were told, is something very unusual, something that not very unusual, I suppose, but something that was not was not tangible. It was this no new virus that was emerging, and we didn't know what the reality of living with this virus, or what the sickness with this virus would look like. The fear of illness in general, because illness in its own, just the concept of illness, can make us feel very frightened, as it brings up a lot of issues around mortality, brings up a lot of issues around stability, brings up a whole host of different issues. And then, of course, of actually becoming sick. What does that actually look like when we become sick? How does that feel? What does that mean for yourself, others? But especially with this illness that seems to have so much mystery and unknown about it. The other aspect of that was very also seemed quite prevalent was the feelings of anxiety, which is very, it's a bedfellow. So usually it's a bedfellow to fear. Often they go together, because when we're fearful, quite often we also feel anxious. Sense of tension, what I would say probably a milder form of anxiety. A feeling of panic for some people, and I think that was very kind of visible. The proof of that was very visible in how people were responding to this need to buy things, to kind of buy concrete things, to assure themselves that they will be okay. At least there will be food. There will be their basic needs will be met. And all throughout the world, what was remarkable is that you can see all throughout the world people doing this. People buying, toilet paper, dry goods, chicken, and all these kinds of very anxious, in a very, very, panicky way. And the other very important thing I just was very striking to me very much at the beginning, certainly in Israel, was the sense of disbelief that this could actually happen. That it was almost like it's unbelievable. It's not happening really. It's just some kind of a flu, or it's just kind of hyped up story, or it's really only happening in China. It's never going to touch us. So that feeling of denial, the disbelief, was also very prevalent at the beginning. I mean, we're probably to some degree not so much there anymore. But as things developed, as the pandemic moved on and as months went by, what I've noticed that was very, very striking was this loss of social connections, because as lockdowns began, or as a request to limit social interactions began to be verbalized, this loss of social connections and emotional impact of that became very clear. With that followed the loss of a sense of the loss of life as we knew it before. If before we could just casually hug a neighbor, or casually hug a child, a child of a friend, now you weren't doing that anymore. You were thinking so much about some of these things that were just part of our life was normal. Not knowing what life after the quarantine or before there is any kind of effective treatment or vaccine would look like. If there is this illness and we don't know what the treatment will be, we also won't know how one deals with this situation. So it kind of brings up a lot of existential anxiety about the unknowns, all these kinds of unknowns, not only about the unknowns of the illness, but also the unknowns of life in many ways. What life will bring and what's around the corner that we might not know very much about. A loss of ability to travel to see one's family became also particularly an issue for immigrants. As I'm sure you know, in Israel, there are a lot of Jews that come from all over the world. So, and I think it became just such a part of our normal life that we just think that we can get on a plane and go anywhere and to see our loved ones anywhere. So that stopped being a real possibility, or easy possibility, we should say. I think that's became very, very problematic. As people literally began to die as a result of coronavirus. So that began to bring up a lot of feelings of bereavement and loss. And I'll say more about that also a little bit later, but I think there's also something to be acknowledged and said about the sense of the loss of the collective, because even people who haven't lost themselves or haven't lost someone, they began to hear about other people dying. And so that also brings up a lot of feelings around collective grief. And the sense of loneliness began also to be a very big issue, because as lockdowns began to happen, as social interactions began to be minimized, as we're being asked to keep distance, um, a lot of people who live by themselves, or a lot of people even who don't live by themselves, began to feel there is that sense of loneliness and a sense of as isolation. And that has a lot of very, very strong emotional connotations for a lot of people. And so that's became also something that was being felt, I think, by a lot of people as the pandemic continued. So one of the things that I want to touch on in this talk is about something about loss and grief, because we often talk about loss and grief or loss and bereavement. We usually, when we mean by that, usually is a loss to concrete death, which makes sense. That's quite typical and quite normal. But here we're starting to have this, what's starting to emerge is the sense of loss, not only of those people who have, who have died as a result of coronavirus, but also a sense of loss of the reality as we lived it before, of life as we lived it before. Now, when you have an actual loss and grief, in many traditions, there are concrete, very specific concrete cultural and religious rituals that help people to deal with loss and bereavement and move through those very complex and intense feelings. I mean, the obvious example would be in the Jewish tradition, but there are many rituals like that in different cultures as well. But here we were finding ourselves faced with quite an unusual situation, because in many situations those feelings of loss were not necessarily specific to a death. It was more related to the loss of the general feeling of loss that people were feeling. So there's something, it's quite a unique emotional situation. How do you deal with a feeling of loss when you actually haven't lost anyone specifically, when it hasn't been concretized? Obviously, for those people who have lost a loved one, that those feelings and that process of grief is much more obvious. But so some of the emotional reactions I noticed, and my colleagues have noticed, as I've been working with my clients and just observing my social circles, my friends and family, is that feeling of uneasiness, that sort of feeling of tension. It's almost like you can't quite fully relax into anything. Have a sense of heaviness, preoccupation, cheerfulness, feeling almost like very sensitive, very on the edge. Some people, it manifested as a kind of difficulties with sleeping, but for others it wasn't even necessarily difficulties with sleeping, but it's like your sleep wasn't restful. It's not that you didn't sleep, but it's just you couldn't quite relax into it. So that you're carrying something all the time that wasn't being resolved in any way. And I think part of that is this constant high level of uncertainty about the illness itself and its treatment, which still continues to be, very much in the air, I think, all throughout the world. So one of the things that began to take place, certainly in Israel, and I know in other countries where there's been period where people have had to be in isolation. I know that's been very much varied in the United States, where that took place, where that didn't take place. But isolation, I think, is something important to talk about, because I think this has been a really, really powerful, painful thing that's happened, but at the same time, I think has enormous potential, because isolation or a lockdown, as when we were asked to be at home and only leave the house for very specific reasons, was really forced people to look at ourselves. Because when we don't have all these distractions, when you don't have these, need to, all the social rituals and all of the things that we do as part of our life, and we think that's just normal life. When we don't have those things, all of a sudden, we're very much one-to-one with ourselves. Now, if you're living by yourself, if you're single, then you're very much one-to-one with yourself. If you're in partnership or you have a family, that makes you feel a little bit differently. But then you're still very much face-to-face with your very concrete, very specific, you're very much faced with your family members and the partner. I'm sorry, Barbara's raising your hand. What's, okay, 1 second. Unmute.
Okay, sorry. A few people have asked that you maybe can speak a little bit slower.
Okay.
Yeah, that's not Okay. I thought it was important to mention. So.
Sure, thank you. I apologize. I didn't realize I was speaking fast. I apologize. Thank you. I'm sorry. Okay, let me again. Okay. Let me just. If there is anything you want me to repeat, maybe you can write it in a box, and Barbara will let me know. But if it's if there is something, you know, if something was very unclear, I'm happy to repeat. But I will try to slow down. Okay. So relationships and isolation. So isolation, as I was saying, lockdowns very much force us to look at to be with ourselves. In some ways, it reminds me to some degree of experience of Shabbat, where so many things we don't do on Shabbat, or we do less on Shabbat, or and very much we end up being in a very different space on Shabbat. Of course, this is not quite the same thing, but in a larger scale, what seems to have happened with the isolation and lockdown is that all the social kind of interactions that was taken away, all of the practical things, all of the that we do as part of just life were taken away, and so it's been a very confronting experience. And for some people, it's been a very painful experience because all of a sudden they were facing things that they perhaps weren't paying attention to, or perhaps they knew that that was inside of them, but they were not able to, or felt not capable, or felt it was too hard to kind of to address. So I think for different people, it looked a little bit differently. So for somebody who lives alone, this particularly or very often brought up is feelings of loneliness. And as I said just a second ago, this need to kind of look at oneself and to really notice some of the things that's happening inside of them. This is also what's true for those people who are in partnerships or who have families. But there, you also have an element of facing your relationships. And it's been really meaningful for me to know from my work with my clients and just from my social circle, that a lot of people have rediscovered their partners. They're rediscovered their children. They have, have said to me, I realize now that I didn't have a relationship with my children in the way that I do now. I didn't see them before the way that I see them now, which can be can be very, very meaningful. At the same time, I also know of situations where excuse me, this kind of time has forced people to discover things that they have not seen, that maybe wasn't so easy to have a look at. I hope this is, I'm speaking a little bit slower. I'm trying to, so please let Barbara know if it is better. I will try even more if it's still not. I really feel very passionate talking about this. So when I feel very passionate talking about something, I tend to speed up because I just feel so much more to share what I've been thinking and living. So I do apologize, really. So thank you for reminding me. So I think what lockdowns have brought up is what does that mean to live in a relationship with oneself? What do we do when we are just, having to relate to ourselves? And it sounds like it's something like, it shouldn't be so difficult, but actually what I found is that for the majority of people, this has been very, very confronting. And a lot of people, when they feel pain or they feel discomfort, try to move away from it. So this situation has created an environment where it's been much more difficult to move away from it. And obviously this also brought up a question of what does that live in relationship with the others, if in the context of your family, but at the same time, this is something, it also brought up issues around how do we live in a relationship with the collective. And I'll speak about that in a second. Excuse me. So I think it was also for me, I wanted to share, I think there was something very powerful of realizing what family means when you're not able to visit them anymore. Because sometimes we take so for granted all the things that we have around us. And so for me, it was always a given, having trotted around the world, that I can just go somewhere and I can just go back whenever I want, and it's not a big deal. Well, that's been a challenge in a very big way. And also, so there's something for me also around learning and leaning into a situation that I actually had very little control over. And I think that's also been something that's so challenging for all of us, is that we tend to move through life thinking that we are in control of almost everything, a lot of things, not everything maybe, but a lot of things. And something so on one hand insignificant and yet so significant took us completely out of control. So so there's something about this dichotomy between isolation and connection that I want to highlight, talking about relationships, because on one hand, you are in isolation, so your relationships are very much limited. At the same time, I think it allowed, or potentially allowed, for an opportunity to connect in a way that wasn't perhaps possible before, precisely because a lot of the distractions were removed. I've been amazed by how some of my relationships and friendships or other relationships have blossomed, and how some have just as of vanished into the thin air. And it was also very confronting experience for me personally. So the other thing that I think that very much stems from this experience is this question about the search for meaning. Because, somehow once we're able to kind of move through our discomfort, or as we're relating to our discomfort in a way that kind of feels meaningful, then we can ask ourselves, what does this all mean? Why is this happening? And what does that mean? For all of us, but also for me personally, for you, everyone who is dealing with it. So there is something about that search for meaning, both individually, and somehow collectively. So on one hand, there's something about the loss of the old situation, old reality that we've lived before, that I think can be very meaningful to people in some ways. But I think also what has emerged is that this has become a unique opportunity for us to face our own limitations, to face our own beliefs that maybe don't serve us anymore, or maybe to face those relationships that no longer seem like a very good social relationship. But actually, to ask a question, what is this relationship about? What am I giving to that relationship? What is it giving back to me? I think for those who believe in a higher reality, or whether you call it God, self, higher power, universe, whatever you want to call it, for those who feel that relationship is important to their life, I think this has been a very meaningful opportunity to reconnect to that, perhaps in the way that they haven't done before. Because that sense of the loss of control has become so poignant and so kind of striking that it's hard not to face it if that belief is part of one's reality. And I think collectively it's quite a deep spiritual moment, I think. Excuse me, I just pressed the wrong button. Very much a deeply spiritual moment, as a possibility. Of course, it's possible because it's what we do with this moment is up to us. But I think very much collectively, it's a deep spiritual moment to be able to rise to our ability to care, to see, to relate to another human, to one another, to another human being. And I think this has become also so visible in many ways through the situation. As one of my colleagues very beautifully said the other day to me, he said, sometimes it feels like we're addicted to our habits. It's like we have a certain way of being, in the world, and it's just so hard for us sometimes to step out of that and just say, what is the larger picture? What is actually going on that's not right in front of me? And I've been very moved personally by how much goodwill and how much care there has been, certainly in my immediate environment where I live now. And but I've seen examples of that all over the world. So I don't think this is some kind of uniquely Israeli, reality. in people being able to help out and reach out and to be there for other people. And I think there's something very meaningful, incredibly powerful in that for all of us. Potential. So the other thing that I wanted to just quickly, very much just connect to speak about is this kind of a play between individual and the collective, because there was something, our culture in general, our Western culture is very focused on the individual. We are very connected to the individual, our individual needs, our individual development, all of which is very important. I'm as a psychotherapist, you can imagine, I am all for that. But I think the situation has very much challenged us to kind of look at other how we relate to the collective, how we connect to others. Can we see ourselves? Can we having the knowledge that related to our individual needs, can we then connect to others in a way that's also meaningful for us as a collective? And I think for many people, it's been very much connected to this or that search for me. So you might be wondering, well, this is all very nice, but what am I supposed to do with this information? This is very interesting, but okay, what can we do to help? What can be helpful? So I would like to spend just now the time to really think about what can you do to help yourself and how we can find tools and how we can use our own resources, because I genuinely believe that we all have our inner resources to be able to help us through this situation. And that's very much for me a very lived and very, very embodied belief. So what I want to start with is by saying that it's really, really important to acknowledge feelings of grief or any other feelings that you may have. And what I say by acknowledging, we have a lot of information nowadays. We live in a world of self-help. You go to any bookstore, they'll have like shelves and shelves and shelves of self-help books, which is great. It's very helpful. But sometimes it becomes an impediment in some ways because we've learned to explain feelings, but we haven't sometimes given ourselves an opportunity to feel them, to really feel what it feels to feel sad, to feel grief. Where does it feel? And when I work with my clients, I really try to help them to connect to their feelings, not just with words, but to really pay attention to your body awareness, your body sensations. And when we will do a meditation in a few minutes, and hopefully you can connect to that within yourself. It's really, really important, because when you name a feeling and you really connect to it, you give yourself an opportunity to allow that feeling to move through you. And I want to say to that is, don't try not to distract yourself how you feel. Because if you do distract yourself, it may feel like in the moment, oh, I feel better because I don't feel, that feeling anymore. But it really doesn't address anything, and it doesn't really help you in the long term. Try to recognize anticipatory grief, which is really anxiety. So what is anticipatory grief? It's the grief of something that hasn't happened yet. So as an example, I can use a personal example. My parents are elderly and they live in, near Chicago. And I, have times I felt overwhelmed with anticipatory grief. What if something happens to them? What if they become ill? What if they die? So there's something about trying to bring that into balance around trying to soothe yourself, trying to connect to that feeling, and then soothing yourself into balancing your own emotions around the fact that nothing has actually happened. Yes, that can happen. It can happen. It's true. It can happen. But it hasn't happened. And not everybody who's elderly catches the virus, and not everybody who catches the virus dies from it. So there's something around, not just saying that to yourself, but trying to really soothe yourself. As you notice this anticipatory grief, which is anticipation of something, of death in many ways. Because death is part of this, or illness is very much part of our of this situation. So letting go of what you can control. Letting go of what you can control it can be very difficult, very, very difficult. We are so used to feeling that we're in control, and it looks like we're in control a lot of the times. But I think the situation has put that into question. This always brings up, it always reminds me, this sounds so simple, but it always reminds me of something that Nathan Sharansky had said. And Nathan Sharansky, as probably you know, was a very famous dissident, a Jew from former Soviet Union, who was in Gulag camps for 9 years, who wanted to immigrate at the time. And this was during the time of the former Soviet Union. And he was in solitary confinement for about half of that time. And he talks a lot about that experience. He's written a beautiful book for those who are interested called Fear No Evil. It's a very, very enlightening book. And he often talks about how he's coped, because, this was somebody who was in literally very real solitary confinement for a lot of time, not at home with Netflix, and he was talked about how he had to, what was one of the very important things is that he had to let go of the fact that he never knew if he will be released, when he'll be released, and if he'll be released. And that's a challenge. I think that can be very challenging. But he's always said that it's if you don't have a control over that, and you have no control of when he'll be released, then it's best to try to not to remove that from your consciousness as much as possible. We're obviously not in that situation, but I think there is a lot of very often for people there's a lot of need and desire to see when will this end, when there will be vaccine, when there will be treatment. We're constantly bombarded with news of who's developing the new vaccine, how far along this is. But at the end of the day, we don't know. Yeah? So accepting changes that are happening around us with minimal judgment. This is something that falls, something that what in psychology we often call the observing ego. It's like part of ourselves that can observe the situation before we respond. Maybe many of you have noticed that when you're having a feeling to something, and then there's a part of you that says, okay, hang on a second, let me just try to see what's going on. Let me think this through. Let me be with it before I respond. And I think this is, there's so much is going on around us, and there's so many things there's so many feelings, reactions we may have to all kinds of things and all kinds of decisions that people have. But we can control that. And so trying to accept that people, for example, make decisions that you may disagree with. Your neighbor might not be wearing a mask, but you can't do anything about it. But you could be wearing a mask, and you could be making a choice to keep away, for example. And that's a change or a position that somebody else may take. You can't, and the less judgment you have about it, the better, I think, emotionally one feels, because it's very easy for many of us to feel that we have, have a lot of feelings, for example, around some of our, people that surround us about some of their decisions and belief systems. Seeing a bigger picture. So where do you fit in this whole situation? What does that mean for you if you look at the bigger picture? That gives a lot of sometimes solace, and that gives a lot of sense of there's something greater going on here. Going back to Sharansky, he often talks about that he always, what kept him very much alive psychologically is that he knew he was a Jew. And he knew that he was part of a bigger world, of a Jewish world, and his identification as a Zionist, as a Jew, was something that, in the darkest moments has kept him alive. Now, this isn't the same situation, of course, but finding that bigger picture, whatever that might mean for you. For me, a bigger picture in some ways is doing these kind of conversations, doing these talks, because I want to be able to share some of what I feel is really important for people. But that for each one of you would be something else. Listening to your inner voice. So focusing, really trying to find what's the most important thing for you, because we can become so distracted. There's so many other people around us with their own agenda, their own feelings, and their own reactions, and own needs, but trying to find a way to listen to your inner voice. And I think one of the very important things to do that is via meditation. And we'll do that in a second. So knowing yourself also, and taking an action from that place. Again, as a way of responding to what's going on around us. Very often we feel like we want to respond, verbally, all kinds of ways, physically sometimes, being somewhere, So finding a sense of what is your core, what are your core beliefs? What is your core? What is it that you really genuinely feel about it? And then acting from that place can be very, very helpful, because then you're really acting from a place of sincerity and a place of real authenticity. Connecting to others can be very helpful. Again, despite the fact that we have such various degrees of social isolation, but there is social isolation all throughout the world. But at the same time, I find it fascinating that just how many connections people have made during this time is just mind-boggling to me. How many more teachers have made themselves available, how many talks and kind of opportunities for learning that's become available. It's really remarkable. I think I've heard a rabbi and a priest talk about that, the churches and, right often attendance in the synagogue is a problem. But now there's so many people that come to online services or various lessons and so on. It's really amazing. You couldn't get people to physically show up to the synagogue, but now they're all available in Zoom. Being patient with yourself. We all want this thing to end. Everybody wants to know there's going to be a vaccine or there's going to be a treatment. We want to, we're tired of this thing. We're tired of our own reactions. We're tired of even having to talk about this. But try to be patient with yourself and just to gently, as you would with a small child that's anxious and kind of impatient, the same way that you would try to soothe a small child, perhaps we would do well with doing that to ourselves. So I want to just the last part of our talk today will be meditation. I would like to spend just a couple of minutes to going through a simple meditation. I don't know whether people have any practice of meditation, so I'm going to just say this is very, very simple. I've chosen the more simple meditation to try because I don't know, what your level of experience is. I do think this is very, very important. I've been meditating since I was 18, so many years. And so mindfulness meditations very much go together. I mean, this is a whole other talk on its own, but basically mindfulness, to make it very simple, it's a really non-judgmental observation. It's one of those things that we just talked about. It's kind of being able to observe things as they are. Yeah, so I could just say, I'm sitting at this table, there's a computer in front of my notebook in front of me. I'm aware that I'm talking to people many, many, many kilometers and miles away from me. That's observing. That's just observing as a fact. I don't make assessment of it. I don't have any judgment around it at the moment. It just is what it is. So once we finish, then when me and Barbara and I will speak, then we'll have a conversation, and that will not be a mindful. That will be a different stance. But you see, just kind of observing and just being as it is, as we are, as it is one of the simplest, maybe. Description of mindfulness. So one of the things I really, really encourage people to do is a breath meditation. It's the simplest meditation there is. There's an ocean of information out there online, in person, or maybe a little bit less in person nowadays, but online on meditation. So you can, shoot yourself. But for those of you who haven't meditated before, what meditation does is that it's a very powerful, very simple, very gentle, but a powerful way for you to reconnect to yourself. So why did I bring it up? Why did I offer it today? Is because I think it's a very powerful way for you to be able to hear your own voice, to connect to yourself, to soothe yourself, to notice what's actually going on inside of you, outside of this distraction of who said what to whom and when. And I even if you meditate for 15 minutes a day, I guarantee you that eventually it will bring its benefits. If doing a breath meditation is difficult, sometimes what you can begin with is by having a candle out, lighting a candle and just focusing on the candle and going through the same steps that we're going to do with the breath meditation. Excuse me. Sometimes focusing inward can be challenging at the beginning. But if you do start with a meditation on a candle, on a candlelight, then I would still really encourage you to eventually try to do a breath meditation. So if you would like to try it with me, it's obviously optional. You don't have to, but I would like to invite you to try it with me. And I would like to invite you to sit somewhere comfortably, to put your feet on the ground somewhere, on the floor. I mean, not literal ground, but on the floor, somewhere that you feel comfortable, that your feet are on the floor. And you can close your eyes if you want to. You don't have to, but it can be very helpful. It's generally very helpful. And you just take a breath in. You just take your breath in, and then notice as the air comes into your body. You don't change it in any way. You're just noticing your breath. You're just noticing your breath. You gently breathe in and out. In and out. Not changing it in any way. Not not doing anything to your breath, just being aware of the air, the breath of air that it comes in through your nose, and you notice the rising and the falling of your stomach. Not judging it, not assessing it. And when these thoughts come in, your mind wanders. Oh, is my breath shallow? Is my breath deep? Am I comfortable? Am I uncomfortable? Do I have an itch somewhere? When all of these thoughts come into your mind, as they will, just bring your mind back. One of the ways you can let go of some of these thoughts is by having an image of releasing of these thoughts. For example, it could be an image of a river, that you're standing by the bank of the river and you're just releasing these thoughts as you let the flowers down the current of the river. As you're having these extra thoughts, there's nothing wrong with that. That's completely normal. Just gently, not judging it, not judging yourself, not saying, not feeling frustrated with yourself that you're having these thoughts. Just gently release them. Maybe you release them as birds, you release them in the air to the blue sky. All you have to do is just gently be present. Notice your breathing. Be aware of your breath as the air comes in, as it travels in your body, as you sense the rising and the falling of the stomach. Don't need to change, just be aware of your breath. You may notice that your breath is slowing down. You may notice that you're breathing deeper. Maybe, maybe not. All just be aware of it. Just notice it. Just be aware of your breath. Notice any sensations you may have in the body. Maybe you feel tension somewhere. Maybe that you notice feelings come up during this time. Thoughts come up, feelings come up. And maybe you notice they're located somewhere in your body. Just be gently aware of them. You don't have to do anything about it. Just be aware that they're there. You may also have images that come to you. You might have a memory that comes to you. Just welcome it. Just welcome it. It's part of who you are. It's part of your being. It just is. Just as you are. Just as your breath is. Just again, notice your breath. Notice any changes that happen to it. You don't have to change it. You don't have to change it yourself. Just be present. Just be present, be gentle, be compassionate to yourself, with yourself. In about a minute or so, we'll come back together to the screen. So those of you who have closed your eyes, or those of you who are staying very much with, right, those of you who are in this process of connecting to your breath, just be aware that in a minute or so, we'll come back together. So just slowly be aware Then you'll be becoming more present, a little bit more conscious. Are there any thoughts that come up at this time? Just welcome them, notice them. If your mind wanders, you can bring it back to, you can just come back to your breath. Okay, so I'm going to ask everyone to come back, to open your eyes. Those of you who are in half closed and close your eyes. So once we stop screen share, maybe some of you will want to share what that experience was like for you. And it's very short, but there's a lot of us here and I can't see anyone, so it's very hard for me to judge where everybody is with this experience. But just wanted to say, for those of you who are finding that difficult, because sometimes it can be difficult, as I said, using a candle to light a candle or just focus on the candle as you become aware of your breath can be an easier way into the practice of meditation. And once you become comfortable with this very simple practice, simpler practice, but also very effective practice, then of course you can, there's a lot of other ways of meditation, other ways of practice of mindfulness and meditation, and you can adopt. And mindfulness doesn't have to apply only to meditation. Mindfulness can also be applied to anything you do, to sitting in front of the computer, to walking, to eating, to talking. It's an attitude of non-judgment and an attitude of compassionate kind of non-judgment. And it's I really I think this can be very, very helpful, and especially at this time, but even outside of this time. So I'm going to start. Yeah, my last slide really is just my contact details. So I'm very happy to be in contact with anyone who has any further questions or would like to discuss anything in addition to our share time now. And I'll let Barbara have that information for anyone who might be interested. So I'm going to stop share. Yep, I'm going to stop share. Let's see.